Hi, my name is Johnny Pollock, and you're with us here as we go into the next session in our Word One-to-One, following this little book as we go through John's Gospel together. And if you have been with us so far, you'll see that we are now going to be in John chapter 11, verses 28 to 57, and we'll be looking at the dead raised to life. In our last session, as you remember, we were with Lazarus, who had just died, and Jesus arriving on the scene. And so if you need to go back, the playlist will give you the links to our previous videos. What you'll see on screen now is the copyright information for the Word One-to-One. It's a wonderful basic Bible study to go through the Gospel of John that is being published by the Word One-to-One and 10ofthose.com. At the link below, you'll be able to see the PDFs files that we're showing on screen and that you can download or indeed buy a hard copy of in order to do it in your own time. So as I said, today we're going to be in John chapter 11 in verse 28 to 57 in chapter 21 of the Word One-to-One book. And to set the scene, Jesus had delayed going to aid of his sick friend Lazarus, who then had died. We're now going to see an amazing miracle from Jesus to show God's glory and enable people to believe in him. Verses 40 and 42 highlights this. Because then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" And then in verse 42, Jesus said to God, "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And so the section breaks into three parts, the first of which being Jesus' reaction at the death of Lazarus shows Jesus' humanity and love. Jesus' raising of Lazarus, secondly, from death shows Jesus' divinity and power. And then thirdly and finally, that the Jews plot to kill Jesus, his death ultimately for the nation. And as we read, I want us to ask ourselves a couple of questions. How do these events reveal God's glory? And how does this help us, even many hundreds of years later, believe? In verse 28 to 31, it said, "After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. 'The teacher is here,' she said, 'and is asking for you.' When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there." So Jesus had come to the town of Bethany, where Lazarus and Mary and Martha lived. Martha had come out immediately in order to see Jesus, to say, "Look, if you had have been here, he would have been okay." And now we're going to read the account of Mary and how she comes to Jesus. And as we read these verses, and as we look into the next slide from verse 32 to 37, we're going to see Jesus in his humanity and also his love for his friend. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So how did Jesus react when he saw Mary crying? Well, it said that he was deeply moved. Actually, the Greek word that was the original in this, it's the word that when horses snort in rage as they go into battle. It says deeply moved, but it actually means furious anger. And also, he was troubled. He was stirred up, churned up inside. And in verse 35, he wept. And the conclusion of the Jews in this anger and fury and bitterness and sadness, the conclusion of the Jews is that they could see that Jesus loved Lazarus. But because they knew he loved Lazarus, they wonder why he hadn't saved him. Now, what does this teach us about Jesus? Well, this combination of anger and anxiety and grief shows Jesus' humanity and his deep love and care for his friends. He is furious at death in God's world that shouldn't have been this way, but because of sin, death had entered the world. He is stirred up at the hurt that death causes, and then he is genuine in his grief at the death of a friend. And so we begin to see all of this play out in the account. But what we're going to notice now is, well, I suppose the reaction of the people there. As we look at the next slide, we want to review some of the verses, because in verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Again, verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then verse 37, finally, but some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus' reaction to the death of Lazarus also shows us what God is like. He's a God of love and care and concern. He shows compassion, including anger at death in the world, the result of rejecting God. But he also knows grief. God understands what impacts us. But then the question does remain, because Lazarus, his friend, still died. And Martha and Mary and the crowd question this. If Jesus loved him, can Jesus do anything about death? Martha raises the issue in verse 21, and then Mary in verse 32, and then the Jews ask the question in verse 37. And as we carry on, we're going to actually see this and see if Jesus is powerful enough as the Son of God to overcome death. Verse 38 says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there will be a bad odor, for it has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now, remember, as it says in the little yellow box, this event is for God's glory in verse 4 at the beginning of chapter 11, and so that you may believe in verse 15. We've just seen Jesus claim to be the resurrection, the one who will call everyone, even from their graves, to the final judgment day. He also claimed to give spiritual life to his followers today, so that, verse 25, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. And so Mary and Martha knew Jesus could prevent death. But what is the state of Lazarus? Well, it's not just preventing death, because Lazarus has been dead and probably embalmed. Body preparation would take place on the day of death. So the body would have been closely examined, prepared and wrapped, kind of mummified in the same day. And so he was in the tomb for 4 days, which means that he was not just dead, but he had begun to rot. Now, he's not just dead, he is dead. And so can Jesus bring life even from this rotting state? Well, the answer is yes. And if Jesus can do this with Lazarus, then surely he can raise the dead from their graves across all time. So, being a public thing, there were the family of Lazarus and also the crowds around him, how do people respond to this? Well, at verse 45, it says, therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. They said this was a very public funeral. There were many people here. It seems that Lazarus and his family were quite well thought of. But it also takes 2 miles from Jerusalem. And as you remember from the accounts that we had before, the religious professionals and the religious passion in Jerusalem was massive because of the temple. And many senior Jews would have likely been there at the funeral and see how they respond. Well, many of the Jews believed in him in verse 45, but then in verse 46, some of them go back to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and they tell them what has happened. The Pharisees, well, they respond. Even his greatest enemies don't say, well, he must have pulled a fast one. They don't doubt the fact that he raised Lazarus from the dead, because so many people have seen it. This is evidence that they have seen and experienced. But instead, in verse 47 and 48, they have a panic meeting. They acknowledge that it is another sign from Jesus, like the healing of the crippled man or the man born blind. And the Pharisees are clearly worried that people are going to believe in Jesus in verse 48. And their response reveals what really matters to them. And we can see this again, not just the evidence that is there before them, but how they respond to it and the things that they're most passionate about in the next slide. Verse 48, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. Not only for the nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. The Jewish leaders here are worried about, significant things for them, but maybe misplaced things. They're worried about the loss of the temple. Now, this is the place where God's relationship with his people was kept up, both by his presence and by the system's sacrifices. So this temple was God's presence and sacrifices to make people right with God. And the loss of the nation, they are God's people, God's chosen race. They were concerned that the Romans would squelch them. So the high priest's answer here is significant. He says it's better for the Jewish leaders that one man dies for the people, basically on behalf of the people, than all the people themselves. So Caiaphas' plan is that Jesus should die rather than everybody perish and suffer. Verse 51 tells us, or John tells us, what is actually going on. He says that this is actually a prophecy from God. Jesus will die on behalf of the nation, but not only for the Jewish nation, but for the scattered children of God. So this is a prophecy of Jesus dying on the cross as the substitute in the place of the people. And we're going to see this in chapter 18. So all of this political wrangling, all of this wonderful miracle and its wonderful truth about the power of Jesus. How did the Jewish leaders respond? Well, verse 53, they planned to put Jesus to death. Now, this is quite interesting, and it's important for us to pause and think about this, especially in light of our next slide. Because what just happened is both crucial in our story, but also really ironic. Caiaphas wanted to murder Jesus. However, without realizing it, he has actually prophesied Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus is going to die in the place of the people. He is going to be the substitute. And this is all part of God's plan. His death on the cross is going to accomplish everything that the temple pointed to, everything that the Jews were worried about losing. If you look back to verse 48, you're going to see this. They were fearful of losing the presence of God, but they were also fearful of not having a sacrifice that would make them right with God. And unlike the religious ceremony and sacrifices at the temple, Jesus' death on the cross brings life and brings those who believe into the family of God. And we're going to see this in John shows us at the cross. That Jesus pays once and for all God's just anger at our sin. And he also brings eternal life for a forgiven people. And it's also available for all people everywhere. And this is what the death and resurrection of Jesus is all about. And it's central because the death and resurrection of Jesus is what the whole Gospel of John is about. It's not about being good enough or being born into God's family. It's not about what we do or how we earn or achieve. It's about what Jesus has done. If he died as a substitute on our behalf, well then we would not perish under God's judgment because he takes the judgment for us. And it's about accepting in faith and trusting that the cross is all we need. Not our achievements, not our earning, not ritual, not religion, but Jesus and him alone. And so this account of raising Lazarus from the dead shows us that Jesus' resurrecting power can be at work in us. It also demonstrates that he is the presence of God and also that he is the sacrifice that makes us right with God once and for all. Not repeated, not week after week or day after day or time after time, but once for all, that in believing in him, that we may have eternal life in the family of God. In our next slide, we go on from verse 54 to 57. And as we finish this out, we get to see what happens after the Jews plot to murder Jesus. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all?" But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it so that they might arrest him. So Jesus withdraws to a village in the wilderness. We don't exactly know for how long, just that the disciples are with him. And the Passover is coming, and the chief priests have given orders to the people. If you see him, report him so that we can arrest him. And ultimately, the desire is to put him to death. Now, as you go back and recap these verses, the slide is here. You can feel free to pause it and read back through. Again, as I said, we're just noticing what is there. We're not looking into traditions or what we surmise this means, but we're simply just looking at the text itself to see the power of Jesus, the presence of Jesus, and the reality of this as it links into the whole account of John. If you do have any questions about any of this, please feel free to ask them. We would love to chat more to you about the Bible and how this all weaves together in this beautiful tapestry to teach us who God is, who Jesus is, what his words are, what he has come to do, and why this matters to you and I. And so as we're going to see from now on, the scene is set. Jesus' hour has come, and John is going to walk us through the remaining life that Jesus has on this earth as he walks towards the cross and his punishment for our sin and his resurrection and glory for our hope. So I hope you'll be with us next time as we walk further into John's Gospel. But as for now, we have been looking through John 11, 28 to 57. And it's going to be good to kind of continue on in our study together. God bless.